Good evening, and welcome back to the quiet frontier. Tonight we return to the wilderness, where the forests grow tall and the rivers run cold, and where a young trapper named William continues learning the patient life of the mountains. Before we begin, I just want to thank you for being here. This channel is still growing, and I put a lot of time and care into writing these stories to help you relax and unwind. If you enjoy the story tonight, leaving a like really helps the channel grow and lets me know you'd like to hear more. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the quiet of the frontier carry you away. Tonight's story continues in the pine forests of the northern frontier, where William begins sealing his cabin against the coming winter. The first frost morning came colder than any before it. A thin layer of frost clung to the ground along the riverbank, turning the tall grasses pale and brittle beneath William's boots. Each step gave a soft, quiet crunch as he walked, the sound carrying faintly through the stillness of the early hour. The world felt different, not yet winter, but no longer fall. William stirred beneath his blanket as the last of the fire's warmth faded beside him. The coals in the stone ring had burned low during the night, leaving only a dim red glow beneath a layer of grey ash. He sat up slowly. The bed of spruce boughs rustled beneath him, releasing the faint scent of pine as he stretched his arms overhead. His shoulders protested the movement, the soreness from days of chopping, lifting and hauling logs settling deeper into his muscles. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift in the cold air. "All right," he murmured, rubbing his hands together. "That's new." The chill lingered longer than it had the day before. It sat in the air, in the ground, in his bones. William leaned forward and took a small stick from beside the fire. He stirred the ashes carefully, pushing aside the grey powder until the hidden coals beneath began to glow brighter. For a moment nothing else happened. Then a small flicker of orange appeared. "Still alive," he said quietly. He reached for a handful of dry pine needles and thin twigs, placing them gently over the coals. The brittle kindling caught quickly, small flames licking upward as the fire slowly returned to life. The warmth spread outward in a soft circle, not strong, but enough. William held his hands toward it and let the heat seep into his fingers. The skin along his knuckles felt dry from the cold, and he rubbed them absently as the fire grew. The river moved quietly nearby. A thin mist rose from its surface, drifting low across the water like a slow, wandering breath. The current didn't freeze, not yet, but the air above it carried a sharp edge that hinted at what was coming. Whitlock had spoken about mornings like this. "First frost's a warning," he had said. "Mountain tells you what's coming, if you're paying attention." William glanced out across the valley. The tops of the grasses shimmered pale. Even the fallen leaves looked stiff and fragile, their colours dulled beneath the frost. He nodded to himself. "I'm paying attention." He stood and walked down to the river with his kettle crouching near the bank to fill it. The cold bit sharply at his fingers as they dipped into the water, and he pulled them back quickly once the kettle was full. "All right," he muttered, shaking his hand once. "That's cold enough." Back at the fire, he set the kettle above the flames and reached into his pack. Breakfast remained simple: salt pork, cornmeal, the same as the day before, but this morning the warmth of it mattered more. As the kettle began to steam, William sat beside the fire and looked toward the trees leading up to the clearing. His cabin. Yesterday the walls had begun to take shape, logs stacked, corners set, the outline of a shelter rising slowly from the forest floor. But now, with the cold settling in, he knew something important. Logs alone would not be enough. The wind would find every gap, every seam, every place where the round timbers failed to meet cleanly. Whitlock had made that clear. "Cold doesn't knock," he used to say. "It slips in quiet." William stared into the fire. Today would not be about cutting more trees. Not first, anyway. Today would be about sealing what he had already built, keeping the warmth in and the cold out. He lifted the kettle and poured the thick mixture into his cup, eating slowly while the fire crackled beside him. The warmth spread through his chest, slow, steady. He finished the last of it and rinsed the kettle in the river before returning to gather his tools. The axe rested where he had left it, the new handle still smooth beneath his grip. He tested the weight once. Solid, reliable. "Good," he said quietly. He slung his rifle across his back and stepped toward the river crossing. The stones were slick with frost now, and he moved carefully as he crossed, the cold water whispering just beneath his boots. On the far side the forest waited. Tall pines, still air, the quiet path leading back to the clearing. William paused for just a moment at the edge of the trees. Then he nodded once to himself. "Let's make you livable." And with that he stepped into the forest, ready to begin the work of sealing his cabin against the coming winter, filling the gaps. The clearing felt colder than the day before, not by much, but enough that William noticed it the moment he stepped between the trees. The air held still in the shade of the pines, and the ground beneath his boots carried a faint stiffness where the frost had not yet fully lifted. The cabin stood where he had left it, low walls of pine stacked carefully, their corners locked together with the notches he'd carved by hand. In the morning light the logs looked pale and raw, their fresh cut still bright against the darker bark. William walked slowly around the structure, 5 logs high now, near to his knee, enough to show the shape of a room, not enough to stop the wind. He crouched beside the wall and pressed his hand near one of the seams between the logs. A thin draught slipped through immediately, cold, sharp. "Yeah," he muttered quietly, "that'll find its way in." He leaned closer and looked through the gap. On the other side, the forest looked just as clear as if there were no wall at all. Whitlock's voice came back to him, calm and certain as ever. "Log stack, wind finds the rest." William nodded. "That sounds about right." He stood and turned toward the low ground near the stream where the moss grew thickest. The damp earth there stayed shaded most of the day, and the moss formed deep green mats between the roots of the trees. He knelt and pulled up a handful. It came loose easily, the fibres holding together in a soft clump. When he squeezed it, the moss compressed and then sprang back slightly in his palm. Good! He gathered more, armfuls this time. Carrying them back to the cabin, he dropped them beside the wall and crouched again. The first clump he pressed into the gap between the lower logs. The moss packed tightly, filling the space where the wind had passed through before. He pushed it in deeper with his fingers. It held, not perfect, but better. William leaned back and studied it. "Well," he said to the wall, "that's an improvement." The wall did not argue. He reached for another handful and began filling the next seam. Slow work, careful work, the kind that didn't look like much from a distance, but made all the difference when the temperature dropped. After a few minutes, William paused. Something had been sitting in the back of his mind. A small thought. Quiet, but persistent. He looked up toward the trees beyond the clearing, his trap line. He hadn't checked the nearest set since yesterday morning. He rubbed his chin. Cabin work was important, but so was food and pelts. A trap left too long could spoil a catch, or worse, lose it entirely. William stood and brushed his hands against his coat. "All right," he said, glancing toward the forest. "Let's see if anything's been kind enough to wander into breakfast." He grabbed his rifle and started toward the stream, following the faint path that led along the water's edge. The forest shifted as he walked. The stillness of the clearing gave way to the quiet movement of the woods. A branch creaked somewhere overhead. Dry leaves rustled softly underfoot. William moved slower now, more deliberate. His eyes scanned the ground ahead. Tracks. Sign. The things Whitlock had taught him to notice. Near the edge of the water he saw them. Small prints in the damp soil. Rabbit. Fresh enough. He crouched briefly, studying them. "Been through here this morning," he murmured. He straightened and continued along the bank until he reached the place where he had set a small snare 2 days before. The bent sapling still stood, the line still tied. William stepped closer. The snare had been sprung, the line pulled tight, and at the end of it, a small rabbit hung still against the brush. William nodded once. "That'll do." He knelt and freed it carefully, resetting the snare out of habit before standing again. Nothing wasted, nothing left undone. Back at camp he would clean it. Simple enough work. Skinning a rabbit didn't take long once a man knew how, and the meat would cook quickly over a steady fire. Lean meat, not much fat. Which meant he'd need to cook it with something heavier if he wanted it to last through the cold. Whitlock had said that too. Lean meat fills you. Fat keeps you warm. William glanced back toward the clearing, toward the half-built cabin waiting among the trees. "All right," he said quietly, shifting the rabbit in his hand. "Let's get back to work." And with that he turned and began walking back through the forest, balancing the work of building with the quiet, necessary rhythm of staying alive in the mountains. Meat and mud. By the time William returned to camp, the frost had fully lifted from the ground, though the air still carried a quiet chill beneath the trees. He set the rabbit down on a flat patch of earth near the fire ring and knelt beside it. The coals still held from the morning. He stirred them gently with a stick, and the faint red glow brightened beneath the ash. A few pieces of pine kindling brought the flames back quickly, the fire rising with a soft crackle. William held his hands near the warmth for a moment. Then he reached for his knife. Skinning a rabbit was work best done while the animal was still fresh. Whitlock had shown him the method the winter before, though not with many words. The old trapper had simply worked, and William had watched. Now the steps came easily, a small cut along the hide. Careful hands. The skin peeled back cleanly when done right, separating from the meat without much trouble. William worked slowly, taking his time, making sure not to waste anything. In the wilderness, waste had a way of catching up with a man. Before long, the rabbit was cleaned and ready. William rinsed the meat lightly in the river and returned to the fire. He placed a small strip of salt pork into the kettle first. The fat began to render slowly as it warmed, melting into a thin layer of grease along the bottom. That part mattered. Rabbit alone was too lean. It filled the stomach, but it didn't last long in the cold. Whitlock had been clear about that. "Fat's what keeps a man going," he had said. William waited until the pork had begun to sizzle, before adding the rabbit meat to the kettle. The smell rose quickly, warm, rich. He stirred it slowly, letting the meat cook in the fat before adding a small handful of cornmeal and water. The mixture thickened as it simmered. Simple, but enough. William sat beside the fire and watched the kettle as it cooked. The forest moved quietly around him. Somewhere nearby a bird called once, then fell silent again. The river carried on as it always did. He ate slowly once the food had cooled enough. The warmth spread through him more steadily than it had that morning. Better. He nodded slightly to himself. That'll hold. When he finished, he rinsed the kettle and set it aside to dry. The rabbit had been small, but it was enough for now. There would be more chances along the trapline in the days ahead. William stood and wiped his hands on his coat before lifting the axe once more. The clearing waited. The cabin walls, the gaps still needing to be filled. When he stepped back into the trees, the quiet returned again. The half-built structure stood where he had left it, unchanged except for the thin lines of moss he had packed into the lower seams. William crouched beside the wall and pressed another handful of moss into place, then another. Slowly the gaps began to disappear. Not completely, but enough that the wall no longer felt open to the forest. After a time he stood and looked toward the river bank. The clay. Moss would fill the space, but something stronger was needed to seal it. He walked down to the darker soil near the water and knelt. The ground there was thick and heavy, the kind that held together when pressed between the fingers. Clay. He dug into it with a stick, pulling free a handful and adding a little water until it formed a rough paste. When he returned to the cabin, he pressed the clay over the moss-filled seam. The mud spread unevenly across the logs. Rough, crude, but it held. William stepped back and studied it. "Well," he said slowly, "that's not winning any awards." He tilted his head. "But it might keep me from freezing." The wall said nothing. William nodded. "Glad we agree." And beneath the quiet canopy of the pines, with mud on his hands and the scent of fresh wood in the air, William the trapper continued the slow, steady work of turning logs into shelter, and shelter into something that might stand against the winter to come. A door to the cold the clay held. Rough lines of mud pressed over the moss had begun to dry along the lower seams, turning from dark and wet to a lighter, cracked surface as the air pulled the moisture away. William crouched beside the wall and pressed his thumb lightly against it. Firm enough. It would need more layers later. But for now, it was doing its job. He stood and stepped back, looking at the cabin again as a whole. The walls had begun to change, not just in height, but in purpose. Before, they had simply been stacked logs. Now they were becoming something that could keep the cold out, something that could hold warmth in. William walked slowly along one side of the square, his boots brushing softly against the moss beneath him. Then he stopped. There, between two sections of wall, a gap remained. Not a crack like the others, a space, wider, untouched. William stood still for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Well," he said, "can't very well walk through a wall." He stepped into the opening and turned, looking back at the cabin from the inside. For the first time he was standing within it, not beside it, not working around it, inside. The walls only reached his thighs, but even so the space felt different, defined, held together. This was where he would sleep, where he would sit by the fire when the snow came, where the wind would press against the logs while he stayed on the other side. William rested his hands on his hips and looked around. "All right," he said quietly, "this is starting to feel like something." He stepped back out through the opening and studied it again. The doorway. It would need framing. If left as it was, the logs would shift as the walls grew higher. The opening could narrow, twist, or even collapse inward over time. Whitlock had explained that too. "Logs settle," he had said. "Everything moves, even when it looks still." William glanced toward the fallen trees at the edge of the clearing. He would need straighter pieces, shorter ones, something he could set upright along each side of the opening to hold its shape. He scratched the back of his neck. "More cutting," he muttered. Then he looked at the doorway again. At least this part won't weigh as much. The forest, as always, had nothing to say on the matter. William stepped back inside the outline once more and crouched near the centre. The ground was still soft there, covered in a thin layer of moss and pine needles. He pressed his hand down into it. Damp. Cool. That would need work later too. A proper floor, or at least packed earth. But that could wait, one thing at a time. He stood again and stepped back out into the clearing. The afternoon light had begun to shift, the sun moving slowly toward the tops of the western trees. Shadows stretched longer now, reaching across the cabin floor and out into the surrounding forest. William picked up the axe and rested it across his shoulder. "Well," he said to the doorway, "we'll get you sorted." He paused, looked at it again, then gave a small nod. "Try not to move while I'm gone." The doorway remained exactly where it was. William chuckled quietly to himself. Good. And with that, he turned toward the trees, ready to cut the pieces that would give his cabin its first true entrance into the cold wilderness beyond. Posts and patience. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood quiet as William approached, the afternoon light filtering through their branches in long, soft beams. He slowed as he walked among them. Not every tree was right for what he needed now. Cabin logs could be thick, heavy, roughly cut. But doorposts were different. They needed to be straight, clean, strong enough to hold their shape as the rest of the cabin settled around them. William ran his hand along the trunk of a young sapling. Too thin. He moved on. Another stood nearby. Slight bend in it. Not good. Whitlock had once told him that the smaller pieces mattered just as much as the large ones. Big logs make the walls, he'd said, but the small ones decide if the door still opens in winter. William stopped beside a straight young tree no wider than his forearm. He stepped back and studied it. Straight grain. Few knots. Good height. "That'll do," he said quietly. The axe came up and struck clean into the base. The sound echoed softly through the trees. A few more swings and the sapling tipped, falling lightly compared to the heavy pines he'd been cutting for the walls. William trimmed the branches quickly, working with smaller, controlled movements now. The piece was lighter, easier to manage, but it still needed shaping. He carried it back to the clearing and set it beside the doorway opening. Then he knelt and took up his knife. The bark came away in long strips, revealing the pale wood beneath. He worked slowly, smoothing the surface where the post would sit against the logs. A clean fit mattered. Rough wood could catch or shift over time. Smooth wood settled better, held better. Once the first post was shaped, William stood it upright along one side of the doorway. He pressed it into place, adjusting it until it sat straight. Then he stepped back and tilted his head slightly. "Don't lean," he said. The post leaned just a little. William sighed. "Of course you do." He crouched again and shaved a small section from the base, then set it back. Better. He nodded once. "That's more like it." The second post took less time. His hands had found the rhythm of the work again, the small, careful cuts shaping the wood just enough to make it fit. Soon both posts stood on either side of the opening. Simple, rough, but enough to hold the doorway in place as the walls continued to rise. William stepped back and looked at it. The cabin now had an entrance, not just a gap, something defined, something held. "Well," he said quietly, "that's about as close to a front door as I've had in a while." He paused, looked around the empty clearing, then nodded to himself. Not much for visitors, anyway. The breeze shifted gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. William rested his hands on his hips and looked at the growing structure. Walls rising, gaps sealing, a doorway standing. Piece by piece the forest was becoming shelter. And though the work was slow, it was steady. He picked up the axe again and turned toward the remaining logs waiting to be cut. There was still daylight left, and the cabin was not yet tall enough to keep the cold at bay. "All right," he said, almost to himself. Back to it. And beneath the quiet sky of the Montana wilderness, William the Trapper returned once more to the rhythm of work that would carry him toward winter. Smoke and quiet snow. The light began to fade not long after the doorposts were set. Shadows stretched longer across the clearing, reaching between the trees and settling into the low places where the sun no longer touched. The warmth of the day slipped away with it, leaving behind that steady mountain chill that seemed to arrive earlier with each passing evening. William stood beside the cabin and looked up at the sky through the gaps in the branches. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, still. He drew a slow breath. Cold, not sharp like morning frost, but deeper. He glanced toward the distant ridgeline. The sky there had taken on a dull grey colour, soft and thick against the fading blue. Whitlock had once said that the mountains spoke in small ways, a shift in wind, a change in light, a quiet stillness where there should have been sound. William watched the sky for a moment longer, then nodded. "Snow," he said quietly. He picked up the axe and gathered his tools. The work would have to wait, not because he wanted it to, but because the mountain had made its decision. He gave the cabin one last look. The walls stood low but steady. The doorway posts held their place. Lines of moss and clay marked the seams where the wind would soon press. "Hold together," he muttered. Then he turned toward the river. The forest felt quieter now as he walked. Even the small sounds, the shifting branches, the distant calls of birds, seemed to have settled into silence, the kind of quiet that came just before weather. William stepped carefully across the stones of the river crossing. The water moved the same as always, but the air above it felt colder now. He reached his camp just as the first faint flakes began to fall. At first he almost didn't notice them, tiny white specks drifting slowly through the air. One landed on his sleeve, then another. He stopped and held his hand out. The flakes melted quickly against his skin. "Not much," he said softly, "but it's starting." He knelt beside the fire ring and stirred the coals. The glow returned. He added a few pieces of dry wood, feeding the flames until the fire burned strong once more. The light flickered against the trees as the snow continued to fall. Slow, quiet, barely enough to cover the ground, but enough to change the feeling of the night. William pulled his blanket around his shoulders and sat beside the fire. The flakes drifted through the air and disappeared as they reached the warmth of the flames. The river whispered in the dark beyond. The forest held its silence, and above it all, the soft beginning of winter settled gently over the valley. William watched it for a while, then nodded once. "All right," he murmured, "time to finish that cabin." The fire cracked softly, the snow fell quietly, and beneath the first light touch of winter, William the trapper sat alone beside his fire, knowing that the work ahead had just become far more important. Night work and small fires. The snow did not last long. By the time the fire had burned steady and the kettle began to warm, the light dusting that had settled over the ground was already beginning to fade, where the earth still held warmth from the day. But it had been enough to remind him. Winter was no longer a distant thought. It was coming. William leaned forward and fed another piece of wood into the fire, watching the flames catch along its edge before settling back into a steady burn. He did not let the fire grow too large. That was another thing Whitlock had been particular about. "A big fire eats wood," he used to say. "A small one keeps you alive longer." William adjusted one of the logs slightly, letting the coals carry most of the heat rather than the flames themselves. The warmth spread low and steady, better for cooking, better for lasting through the night. He reached for the kettle and filled it again with water from the river, setting it over the fire to heat. The rabbit from earlier had been enough for the day, but a man who worked as hard as he had would wake hungry if he didn't eat again before sleeping. From his pack he pulled a small portion of dried meat. Tough, lean, but it would soften once it simmered. He dropped it into the kettle and added a pinch of cornmeal, stirring slowly as the mixture began to thicken. The smell rose gently into the cold night air. William sat back and let it cook. The fire crackled softly. The river moved as it always did, and the faint memory of falling snow still lingered in the quiet around him. He glanced toward the trees, then toward the path leading back to the clearing. The cabin. It was not finished, not even close, but it was started, and that mattered. Whitlock had said something like that once too. Half a cabin's better than none, if you keep working, William nodded to himself. Guess I'll keep working then. He stirred the kettle again. The dried meat had softened enough now. Not as good as fresh, but it would hold. He ate slowly, letting the warmth settle into him while the fire burned low and steady beside him. Afterward he set the kettle aside and leaned back against the log behind him. The night had grown quiet again, no wind, no movement, just the steady rhythm of the river and the soft crackle of the fire. William pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He watched the flames for a long moment, then glanced up toward the dark sky above the trees. No more snow falling now, but it would return. Soon. He knew that. The mountains had already given their warning. William shifted slightly, settling into the bed of spruce boughs beneath him. His body carried the weight of the day's work. His hands still felt the rough grain of the logs, the damp press of moss, the cold bite of clay, all of it part of the same slow task, building something that could stand, something that could hold, something that could keep him alive when the snow stopped being gentle. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again and looked toward the fire. Tomorrow, he murmured quietly, higher walls. The fire answered with a soft pop. The river carried on in the darkness, and beneath the quiet sky of the northern frontier, William the trapper rested beside his small, careful fire, preparing for another day of work in a wilderness that was beginning, slowly, to turn toward winter. He ate slowly, letting the warmth settle into him while the fire burned low and steady beside him. Afterward he set the kettle aside and leaned back against the log behind him. The night had grown quiet again, no wind, no movement, just the steady rhythm of the river and the soft crackle of the fire. William pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He watched the flames for a long moment, then glanced up toward the dark sky above the trees. No more snow falling now, but it would return. Soon. He knew that. The mountains had already given their warning. William shifted slightly, settling into the bed of spruce boughs beneath him. His body carried the weight of the day's work. His hands still felt the rough grain of the logs, the damp press of moss, the cold bite of clay, all of it part of the same slow task, building something that could stand, something that could hold, something that could keep him alive when the snow stopped being gentle. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again and looked toward the fire. Tomorrow, he murmured quietly, higher walls. The fire answered with a soft pop. The river carried on in the darkness, and beneath the quiet sky of the northern frontier, William the trapper rested beside his small, careful fire, preparing for another day of work in a wilderness that was beginning, slowly, to turn toward winter.